You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 22nd of July, 2024, on Monocle Radio.
Can Kamala Harris shake the Democrats from their slumber? Could a lame duck Biden presidency shake up the Middle East? And does all of this crazy news give us a hankering for an apocalyptic basket of cheesy macaroni? I'm Chris Chermak. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. My guests, Alex von Tunzelmann and Charles Hecker, will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the Farnborough Air Show, where our very own Andrew Muller has been spending the day looking at planes big and small. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily, and I'm Chris Chermak. I'm joined today by Alex von Tunzelmann, historian, author, and screenwriter, and by Charles Hecker, senior partner at Control Risks. Hello to you both.
Hi.
Good evening.
Charles, I'll start with you. What were you up to this weekend while some certain important announcement that we will be discussing was happening?
Yeah, I suppose this is the beginning of one of those moments that you'll remember that for the rest of your life. Something as momentous as sort of where were you during high-profile political assassinations. As it so happens, I was on a video chat.
Just last weekend. We can talk about that one too, for that matter.
There was that one. I was referring to an even more momentous one a number of decades ago. But this is one of those moments that's preserved in aspic. Where were you and what were you doing when you heard the news? And as it so happens, I was doing a video chat with an American friend who lives in the UAE, and we were having a very political conversation, as we typically do, this friend of mine and I. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of this conversation, both of our phones started to explode, and we heard the news.
Alex, what about you? I mean, do you also, aside from where you were, I wonder, from you with your historical hat on, as it were, where does this rank in the kind of we remember where we were kind of moments?
Well, I mean, I think the entire last week is sort of a blur of such moments, actually. And
yeah, they all kind of fold into one a little bit.
Yes, you feel like there are going to be a whole history courses on, well, which part of July 2024 are you studying? I mean, it's sort of which week. But yes, I was Sunday evening, as it was in London. I was up on my roof terrace, actually, with my husband. We were having a cheeky little mojito to end the weekend. And then indeed, suddenly the phones sort of started beeping and coming alive. And we realised, and I thought, oh gosh, I'm going to have to talk about this on the radio tomorrow.
Did that first lead you to just get another drink?
I mean, we certainly did finish the mojitos, to be clear. Yes.
Well, it has been just about 24 hours since Joe Biden turned the political world on its head by announcing what, let's face it, had become all but inevitable. Biden said he would step back from the 2024 presidential campaign and get on with the business of governing and only governing for the next 6 months. In the last 24 hours, there has also been a lightning-fast coalescence around the U.S. Vice President, Kamala Harris, as the Democratic Party's heir apparent. Harris did make her first public appearance since Biden's announcement just a short while ago. Here's a little of what she had to say about Joe Biden.
And I wanted to say a few words about our president. Joe Biden's legacy of accomplishment over the past 3 years is unmatched in modern history. In one term, he has already, yes, you may clap. In one term, he has already surpassed the legacy of most presidents who have served 2 terms in office. And I first came to know President Biden through his son, Beau. We worked together as attorneys general in our states. And back then, Beau would often tell me stories about his dad. He would talk about the kind of father and the kind of man that Joe Biden is. The qualities that Beau revered in his father are the same qualities that I have seen every day in our president. His honesty, his integrity, his commitment to his faith and his family, his big heart, and his love, deep love of our country. And I am firsthand witness that every day our President Joe Biden fights for the American people, and we are deeply, deeply grateful for his service to our nation.
Kamala Harris there. Charles, there is something deeply historic about this moment, I suppose, when you listen even to just a minute of Kamala Harris there. I mean, I could see you listening and kind of taking it in, as it were. It is just, what can you say? I mean, at the very least, what we can say is this race, this election that, frankly, I was dreading Biden-Trump 2024 and covering that for another few months, it's gotten pretty interesting again.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's been an enormous injection of energy into the contest. And, there was enough of there was from the other side an injection of energy when President Trump was narrowly missed an assassination attempt by a bullet that grazed his ears, and completely transformed his candidacy and the Republican National Convention. And now, just literally moments later, historically speaking, we have a complete turnaround in the campaign from the Democrats. And so what is interesting about this moment is the phenomenal change in energy. But since this is a moment of great gravitas, because it happens so rarely in political life, you have seen this sort of reverential attitude, this sort of heaviness to the way that people are talking about Biden and the ponderous nature of their speech, adding to sort of the genuinely transformational moment that's taking place in politics right now.
Alex, where does this rank in unprecedentedness, if I could say that for you? I mean, I have heard some people going all the way back to George Washington, which seems a little bit of a stretch, but there have been, to Charles's point about kind of this legacy talk of Joe Biden now, the fact that he stepped down just like George Washington did when he could have run again.
Yes, I suppose that moment could strike you. I mean, I do think, it's an absolutely huge moment, and it's going to be, obviously, we don't yet know where any of these pieces will settle. I mean, we're still in the middle of the moment, so it's quite hard to see, everything that's going to happen from here. I do think it's pretty nailed on now that Kamala has the nomination. I mean, it doesn't seem like there's any real serious contenders. And, you think, I mean, even with the last couple of people that have yet to rule themselves out, I mean, if they stand against her, then they're ruling themselves out as her VP pick. So that now seems strategically like a pretty bad idea for many of them. So I think, this is going to proceeding incredibly fast. I mean, I think two things I was very struck by were, first of all, how incredibly quickly, actually, the Democrats have fallen into line and sorted this out, which was something that I was rather impressed by, perhaps hadn't expected to be quite so efficient. And secondly, I was very struck by how unprepared Donald Trump seems for this and how he's basically now had a 24-hour meltdown on his social media about it.
He has, absolutely. I mean, it is interesting. We were talking about this before the show, the fact that Donald Trump basically tweeted, we have spent all this energy trying to take down Joe Biden, and now we have to start all over again. And he'd basically like his money back for all of the ad campaigns, Charles. I mean, what do you expect he will be doing to try now to, I guess, identify Kamala Harris, if you will, define her as the lingo goes in political circles?
Right. Their first two attempts, and I agree that this was an incredibly weak response from the Republicans, and their first two attempts to impose their sort of imprint on this transition really failed to cut through, and I think failed to hold any resonance with the voting public. And that was that you had the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, calling for the president to resign, saying that, look, if you're not good enough to campaign, then you're not good enough to remain in office. You should leave. And then there was...
Which, though, to the point of trying to figure out what the Republicans are going to do, this was Donald Trump, too, talking about Joe Biden about 9 times since he actually left. They still don't know how to talk about Kamala Harris.
Well, exactly right. I mean, they haven't yet switched to the past tense when it comes to talking about Joe Biden. The other thing that they did was that they were calling this a sort of a coup attempt in an anti-democratic move, that they have invalidated the 14 million votes that were cast in the Democratic primaries. And, forgive me, but Crimea River for Republicans who were suddenly, concerned about Democratic primary voters, that really, really failed to cut through. The last thing they tried to do, and this will be what they do going forward, is saying that, you buy Harris and you get Biden, and they will try to weld the two of them together going forward.
Well, Alex, to your point about the coalescing and how quickly it has happened, let's hear one other clip because Monocle's U.S. editor Chris Lord spoke with Josh Green. He's the governor of Hawaii, who was bullish on Kamala's prospects.
I believe this primary is all but settled. Kamala has been a great soldier. She also has been very supportive of the president, who's been supportive of me. So when the president endorsed her, I immediately endorsed her also. I have a fondness for the vice president. Jamie and I, that's our first lady. We had supper with the vice president and Doug at the White House, I don't know, a few months ago, 3 hours together. She has a deep understanding of Hawaii, which was excellent, my state. So I don't think there's going to be much of a contested primary. I think it's going to go quickly to her as the nominee. That's what all of the tea leaves seem to say. I think actually we are on our way.
Hawaii Governor Josh Green there. You can hear more of that interview on tomorrow's Globalist. But Alex, I mean, aside from just the fact that this seems to be a done deal, or if it is, barring a miracle, she will become the first black woman to be nominated as a U.S. presidential candidate, the second woman after Hillary Clinton. Is there a reason, I feel like I have to ask, is there a reason why some countries, even supposedly progressive ones like the U.S., have found this so hard to do?
Well, we could be here for a long time if we want to discuss that question in its full historical context. I mean, it's clearly overdue. Obviously, many other countries have had, in the Western world, have had women leaders. In fact, many countries all over the world have had women leaders. Many countries in the Western world have had leaders from ethnic minority groups as well. This is, long overdue, realistically. But, I mean, aside from that, and I think, it's going to be very interesting. I think the question will now move to who is her vice presidential pick. And obviously some of the names we saw bandied around as possible candidates will come up again in that question.
Well, exactly. That's what I was wondering as well. Charles, I mean, do you think, is this one of these things where, given the sensitivities in the U.S., I suppose, to put it that way, this necessitates a balanced ticket? Is that kind of the sad reality that two women on a ticket would not work? Is that part of, because I mean, one of the candidates that would be probably the most ideal is Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan. Is this sort of the reason she might not get it?
That's right. So Gretchen Whitmer actually took herself out of the running for any sort of candidacy or nomination by endorsing Vice President Harris to gain the nomination. It is probably too big an ask of the American public, just as Alex has pointed out, perhaps unprepared for two women on the ticket, although both of them, together or separately, are very strong candidates. It is probably likewise too early for Kamala Harris to name Pete Buttigieg, who's gay, as her running mate, although he has shown over and over and over again that he can make absolute mince out of anybody that he shares a platform, a debate platform with. This has to be a balanced ticket in the same way, frankly, when we leapt another hurdle, and that is that Barack Obama chose Joe Biden as his running mate in an attempt to balance out the ticket. Lastly on this, just very briefly, we have to remember that this really isn't about red states or blue states anymore. This is about 3 or 4 states that are in play. And Harris will probably lean towards somebody like Josh Shapiro, the governor of swing state Pennsylvania.
Alex, just one other historical aspect of this that strikes me. Now that Joe Biden is not the nominee, Donald Trump would become the oldest president ever in the United States if he were to win this race. His opponent, I remember very well, Nikki Haley, back in the primary, said that the first party that abandons its 80-something candidate will win this election. Do you think she's right?
Well, I mean, that's going to be very interesting to watch, isn't it? I did see that a Haley super PAC actually backed Kamala Harris yesterday. So that's moving very fast, that situation, I would suggest. Yes, and I think the fact that Republicans have so framed their campaign against Biden as just being too old, and that's something Trump has dug into. It's something that the whole Republican kind of machine has dug into. Well, what have they got now? Because Kamala is not old. Trump now is the oldest candidate, as you suggest. So this is, I think that's really kind of going to backfire, to be honest.
Well, let's move on a little bit, because Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will be among the first leaders to greet a newly freed from campaigning Joe Biden this week as he travels to Washington, just as Israel appears to be opening yet another front in the Middle East by striking Yemeni targets over the weekend. Charles, I wonder on this, with Netanyahu coming in this week of all weeks, what does he want out of the U.S. at this point? How do you expect him to use a trip like this? A promise from Biden that he'll kind of stay the course, join strikes on Yemen, Hezbollah, anyone else that gets in Netanyahu's way?
Yeah, Benjamin Netanyahu must be absolutely sort of cursing his sort of luck to be coming to the United States at a time like this. I think what he's going to...
He loves the limelight, doesn't he? It's sort of... Yeah,
he loves the limelight. And this is his fourth speech in front of a joint session of Congress, which is the most any foreign leader has ever addressed the U.S. Congress. So he likes the limelight. They give him the limelight. But I think that the light will be slightly dimmer, if I can just stretch the metaphor a tiny bit, this time around. Now that Biden is out of the reelection campaign, he has a limited amount of time and a limited amount of bandwidth to make change in the remaining few months of his presidency. And I guess what Netanyahu will want is he will turn to Biden and say, if there's one more thing that you can do with the time that you have left in your presidency, let it be a gesture of support for Israel. There's a lot to do. Besides that, there's Ukraine, and there is the Harris campaign. There's a lot of things that are begging for the president's attention. And, it's been tough love from the White House to Netanyahu so far. So from Netanyahu's perspective, this is a very big ask.
And there is, to that point, Alex, the question not just, though, of what Netanyahu wants, but maybe what Joe Biden wants. He now has a few months left. What does he want his legacy to be? And given that Gaza has been a part of the, his later legacy of the later part of his term, do you imagine he might, take some kind of opportunity here to put some of his imprint on here now that he's not running for re-election?
I think it's going to be really interesting to watch because, I think Gaza is probably the part of Biden's legacy that's most liable to come in for criticism. It's been very unpopular, his policy, particularly with younger voters, more progressive voters, have been highly critical of it. Harris, no American presidential candidate is anti-Israel, to be clear, but Harris is, should we say, definitely a little cooler than Biden on it. Biden, of course, is from that generation that very much grew up with Israel as this, plucky little underdog fighting, for its survival and freedom. When we get into Harris isn't quite Generation X, but she very nearly is, that sort of generation have a very, very different view of Israel. And the younger generations, Gen Z or anything else, have a completely different view of Israel. So I think there is he's in a very precarious position, Netanyahu, actually coming over now. I think it's a huge disaster, the timing, from his point of view. And of course, he very much favours Trump. And suddenly Trump is looking much less nailed on than he was a week ago to win. So this is, actually a very, very complicated, delicate moment. Who knows what Biden will do? I do think Biden inherently is actually very supportive of Israel, very nostalgic about the kind of possibilities of Israel and so forth. But as I say, he has faced a great deal of criticism, so it's interesting to see in which direction he'll move.
As much as this moment is something, Charles, that is out of Netanyahu's control because of what's happening in the U.S., it does sort of beg the question for me about, Netanyahu used to be perhaps very good at injecting himself into the U.S. conversation and kind of moving politics to some of the ways he's wanted in the past. Do you think he's kind of lost a little of that ability, or has the U.S. also, to Alex's point about younger generation and so on and so forth, become a little more diverse in its views towards Israel?
Yeah, I think that Netanyahu's position on this trip is not nearly as strong as some of his other trips. And we should also remember that one of his speeches in front of Congress was essentially done behind the back of President Obama, which didn't really win him very many points in Washington. And
there was still an Iran deal passed, which is what he was trying at the time to avoid.
Precisely right. And let's also remember that there's very little domestic support for Netanyahu in Israel for this trip abroad. Israel's hostage families, who are now a very, very prominent political force on the ground in Israel, are very much against the prime minister leaving the country with their problems and their issues unresolved. Of course, there are a lot of people who believe that Netanyahu is prolonging the war to save his own political skin. cozying up to the White House in the United States is one of those things that sort of helps. The U.S. will not want to encourage that, though. I mean, I really don't think that there's that much love lost right now between Biden and Bibi, as they say. I mean, Alex is right. Biden comes from that generation where support for Israel was an American political litmus test. But I think that the ties are really thin. So I think he's here at a very, very precarious moment.
Surely, even if there is that support, obviously, for Israel of Biden's generation, Alex, Middle East peace would be something irresistible for any president. We talk about this at various points. Various presidents have tried. I just do wonder, do you think that might be something that Joe Biden wants to tackle in his last few months or something? Or maybe U.S. recognition of the state of Palestine, something a little bit bold when it comes to the Middle East.
That would be huge. And I think, and of course, in Britain, the Labour Party that's now in government has in its manifesto that they will recognise the state of Palestine during this parliament. They don't have a date on that, but that is in train. And we've already had the UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy restored funding to UNRWA, and that's already happened. So, which is distinct from US policy on that issue. So, of course, Biden could do something spectacular, but I do think that's probably quite unlikely. And I mean, I think if Middle East peace was in his gift, I'm sure he'd do that, absolutely no question. But I mean, of course, that's all,
I suppose it's not quite up to him.
No. I think there's an awful lot of moving parts now. You've got the Houthis, of course, now engaging with Israel kind of to the south. You've got the issue with Hezbollah and Lebanon. There's a lot going on. And I wonder how much influence Biden has over that. What he does have influence over is US policy. So we'll see.
Just perhaps from you both, before we move beyond this US topic that we've been discussing, a word on just what Biden's legacy is for you, Charles.
Biden has been a public servant for a half a century in the United States, and it's been capped with the presidency. But it includes 2 terms as vice president. It includes, I'm sure I'll get this wrong, but something like 45 years in the Senate. It is a legacy of public service. It's a legacy of empathy. It's a legacy of overcoming personal, professional, and political challenges. And it's been a thumping, really, by any sort of objective measure, if we're going to stay quite politically neutral about this, in terms of economics and in terms of what happened with the pandemic and the post-Trump period. The presidency has been a successful one. And, speaking in front of a historian, we'll have to wait a while until this all shakes out. But I think that taken in the round, it's a half a century of public service.
Alex?
I do tend to think at the moment that Biden's legacy will be looked upon pretty positively overall, domestically, maybe a few points such as immigration that people might have some critiques of. But I think overall it's a very positive legacy. I think things like cancelling student debt have made an enormous difference to a lot of people. I do think at the moment the potential fly in the ointment is Gaza. I think that's probably the most likely thing to come in for criticism, but, it's not over yet. And I also think that's going to depend very much on what comes next, because realistically, for the people that don't like what Biden has done on Gaza, if Trump wins in November, it will be much worse. So we'll see what happens.
Well, let's move on to a couple of other topics for the end of the show. Before this weekend's political madness kicked off in the United States, the only thing anyone could talk about was CrowdStrike, this being the software company that, by the grace of one faulty update, managed to wreak havoc on computer systems across industries and pretty much the entire globe. Charles, I wonder, did this impact you personally? Did you see the dreaded blue screen asking you to update your computer or anywhere else you were? I can say that I was flying over the weekend from Dulles in Washington to London. My flight was fine, but I did see that dreaded blue screen a few times at the airport.
Did you really? So without wanting to sort of get into the land of sort of product endorsements, the operating system that I use is a little bit different than the more widespread operating systems that a lot of people use. And some of the products that were most gravely affected by this outage are not necessarily present on my laptop. That's a long way around.
Were you gleeful? Was there schadenfreude? I mean, how did that make you feel?
I'll tell you, when I started to read about this, I was afraid to log on. I was just like, the minute I touch my laptop, something is going to go wrong. Let this all blow over before I even press the on switch. But we're slaves to our laptops. We're slaves to technology. I pressed the on button and everything was fine.
Alex, it seems like every time something like this happens, we all kind of throw up our hands and marvel at the sort of why all of our IT and other systems are all controlled by just one company. Will we ever learn?
Well, we'd better, I think, because this is very, very serious. I mean, it's something like 85% of systems going through Microsoft and CrowdStrike. And I mean, that's a ridiculous level of consolidation in an industry. But also, of course, what's happened is not just that people have consolidated around that, but that, of course, more and more this has been outsourced. So company internet security is outsourced to CrowdStrike or something like that, rather than having an in-house IT team that might have set this up for you. Hey, great, we can fire those guys. We'll just press a button and it's done on the cloud or whatever. No. Okay. That looks like really, really poor, kind of corporate policy now. I think, you have to start thinking about where is your backup system? What's going to happen? And, for me, even I experienced it in a small way. I was trying to book a GP appointment that morning. Absolutely no chance of doing so. Thankfully, nothing urgent, just a regular checkup. But I'm sure there were lots of people who did have urgent needs, who were indeed, very much then in trouble, then probably had to go to A&E rather than go to a GP, which, of course, is going to lead to all sorts of further problems down the line. So, it become very chaotic. And I mean, as a historian and researcher, we had a huge, this wasn't a cyber attack, of course, this was a faulty update, but we did have a big cyber attack on the British Library last year. It's taken them months and months and months to get anywhere near coming back to capacity. And I think this is a major ongoing, cybersecurity, and whether that is to do with updates or to do with malicious attacks, is a very, very major issue for not just for companies going forward, but for public bodies and for resources and for all of these, for everybody, actually.
I did have this feeling, Charles, that I was wondering if you were the person who brought down the world's IT systems. I mean, would you wear that as a sort of badge of honor? Would you put it as your CV, or would you crawl into a corner and hide?
Can you just imagine the person who pressed send on this update? And all I can hope, you want to sort of see this as a teachable moment, and you kind of hope that person is treated humanely. The market did not treat CrowdStrike very humanely. I think something like 20% of the company's value was wiped off the books with its share price. So, if you were that person, it may not be something that you put on your CV going forward.
Perhaps take up carpentry.
Carpentry, is that the way to go?
Yes, exactly.
Well, the next time that an IT glitch causes all of civilization to come to a standstill, you'll be happy to know that there is one food company that's helping you prepare for the absolute worst of all worlds. Costco is now selling a food basket designed for the apocalypse or something close to it. The baskets include enough freeze-dried and dehydrated meals for 150 servings, all with a sell-by date of 25 years, which is nice of them. I thought, if you ask me, they don't make you buy one, a new one every 5 or 10 years. I mean, Alex, are we eager to buy one of these? $80 is actually not a bad price for, 150 servings.
No, it's pretty good. I mean, I thought I think what Costco have achieved here is an incredible public relations feat, because, of course, we're all talking about them. Lovely, they're not paying any advertising money at all, and here we are all discussing them. But I think to be fair, there are, everybody's making plenty of fun memes and jokes about the apocalypse happening and, have you got your spaghetti Alfredo going on? But I do think there probably are some slightly more serious applications for this, because what we have seen in recent years is quite serious climate incidents, and then perhaps being cut off for a few days or for anything from your resources. You'd be pretty happy that you had your 25-year disaster box sitting in your cupboard, potentially, although you do still need clean water to make any of the meals. So that's another
That's been pointed out a number of times, hasn't it? Exactly. Where would the water come from?
Yeah, you want a water tank as well. And then, of course, if you're the person with the Costco meal boxes and the water tank, you're probably going to need a gun, because otherwise somebody else is going to come and take that straight off you. So, this is how it turns into a full prepper situation with building a bunker for yourself.
I was reminded, though, on that somewhat serious part of the serious point that Alex was making, Charles, our parents, grandparents, did that thing. My grandparents did the thing of never throwing food away, remembering those days. I mean, I don't know if they had a survival kit or not, but this does sort of harken back to another generation that at the same time maybe is sort of coming back into fashion.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I first just want to say that, look, you know what? If we need food for the next 25 years and there's no place else to get it, I do not want a 25-year supply of macaroni and cheese. I want a 25-year supply of tequila and nothing else. But
not the Alfredo pasta either, or the apple cinnamon cereal.
You know, I'm going to pass. You know, tequila covers all the food groups that you need post-apocalypse. But to seriously answer a serious question, you're absolutely right, Chris, and that is that this is a topic that is returning to sort of dinner table conversations, and that is whether it's in anticipation of a national grid incident or a climate incident or a cyber incident or political upheaval or military conflict. Increasing numbers of people are thinking, am I prepared for this? What do I need to do to be prepared for this? Costco is kind of funny in sort of always having its finger on the pulse of the American consumer. You're right, it's the best PR stunt ever. There is more than a tiny bit of truth underneath all of this.
Alex, I did wonder to end what the British version would include. What would you like it to have? I guess, does the beans on toast, I guess that kind of works?
Oh, gosh, yes, I'm afraid it might be a bit bleak, the British version. I'm not sure we'd want to survive 25 years. I mean, although, of course, modern British food is much more diverse, so let's hope we could get some chicken tikka masala, some chop suey, some of these great new British dishes into there, which at least would liven things up a bit beyond beans on toast.
Beyond beans on toast. We can always hope. Charles Hecker and Alex von Tunzelmann, thank you very much for joining us. And finally, on today's show, we head to Farnborough, home of one of the world's biggest annual air shows, which is being taken in this week by Monocle's contributing editor and the normal host of this very program, Andrew Muller. Andrew, what kind of planes have you seen today?
Loads, really. I mean, that's the obvious thing to say about attending an air show. Yes, there are loads of planes. But there is a mix at Farnborough, as there always is, I think, of both the civilian and the military. So, and you do get to see both parked and in the air. I think it's fair to say that listeners could probably take a wild guess as to which variety of aircraft attracts the most upward glances and oohs and ahs. It turns out there's a lot more you can do with an F-35 than you can with an A321, however objectively impressive a piece of engineering they are. Yeah, there's been plenty of everything. It's very loud. I'm indoors at the moment. Listeners may be able to pick up an amount of authentic airshow hubbub. The day is sort of dying down a bit at this point, though. I think it's only day one, and for the real hardcore who come here, this is a bit like aviation business Glastonbury. So everyone's pacing themselves at this point. I'm sure Friday's an absolute madhouse.
I mean, is everyone's eardrums going to be completely busted by Friday? Is that part of the experience then as well?
Yeah, much like Glastonbury, in fact, yes. I suspect that's very, very possible.
Well, one other thing I wanted to ask you was just curious whether politics does enter these sorts of shows. I mean, especially given your normal occupations, Andrew. Is everyone there asking you for your hot Kamala Harris take and where she's going, or something like the IT glitch that was impacting all of aviation and we were just talking about on this show?
No, strangely, none of that sort of thing has come up. And I have been asking people about that. But as regular attendees have been saying, this whole thing is very business focused for the aviation world. It's up there certainly with Berlin and Paris as just a fantastic compressed networking event. I was just speaking to somebody from actually a reasonably, a smallish company, a company called Beagle, based not far from here. And they make all the stuff or a lot of the stuff that goes into aeroplanes that you just don't think about. They make all the little bits that are turned into the big bit that you get to fly around on. And as he said, like last year, honestly, the stall paid for itself over and over again because, the amount of new business you generate just by meeting people who drift past and are interested in something you're exhibiting and want to have a bit of a chat, the chance to catch up with your regular suppliers. the chance to keep an eye on what your competition's doing. So yeah, it's taken very seriously by the people here, and it sounds like that it's not something anybody wants to miss out on. As the chap from this same company said, if we didn't think we would make a profit doing this, it's not worth a company of our size coming here. But we do. It turns out it actually is a genuinely valuable thing for people to come to.
Is there some kind of theme for the show, either this year or in general? I mean, aside from the buying that, as you described there, I mean, that obviously always happens and is a key part of what happens at these air shows in general. But, I mean, do you detect any kind of theme for this one? You have been talking, I understand, also a lot about clean aviation.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's no theme, as I understand it, imposed from on high, but it's very, very clear that this is a theme. Clean aviation, as you allude to, not just of this event, but of the aviation industry as a whole. People understand that commercial aviation in particular gets a terribly bad rap as a contributor to carbon emissions and not wrongly. So people understand that there's a reputational issue that needs to be addressed, but they also understand, everyone understands, that the kerosene engine is not the future. This is just not what it's going to be like several decades hence. So it is just all a question of, what can be done with electric engines, with hybrid engines, to what level can they be scaled, and how soon will that happen? And somebody I was talking to who does work for a company which is working on hybrid engines says it is readily imaginable that within 10, 20 years, you will start to get these things able to carry aircraft of the scale of a 737 or an A321, and once you remove the carbon emissions that class of aircraft creates, then you've made a huge leap forward, because, as he said, that's the ball game. Obviously, carbon emissions are created by your bigger lumbering long-haul transatlantic variety airliners and also by smaller aircraft, but given the enormous number of the world's shorter haul routes flown by things like those Airbuses and those Boeings, if you could get those things, or if you could wean those things off kerosene, that would be a huge deal.
And just one other aspect I wanted to ask you about, Andrew, this idea of not just planes being used for long-haul flights, but they're kind of getting ever shorter. I understand you were also speaking to some companies that are looking at the urban side, sort of within cities or between cities, that kind of thing. I mean, do you get the sense from the people you talk to there that this is the future? We're going to be hopping on an airport taxi at a city, an airport taxi at a city near us?
They're absolutely serious about it. I was speaking to the CEO of a company called Voltero, who make this marvelous little aircraft called a Casio, which it looks, to be honest, like, those ideas people had in the 1950s or 1960s of like the flying car. That you would drive your thing to work, but at some point press a button and wings would sprout, and you could just sort of take off from the highway.
The Jetsons, basically. That's what we're talking here.
Basically the Jetsons vibe. They're not promising that sort of thing, but it's actually not that far away. This is going to be, initially at least, a sort of 4 or 5-seater little aircraft. It will fly entirely electric for shorter hops. It'll use its hybrid motors for longer ones, but they have already taken pre-orders for 232 of them, they told me, and these things will start rolling out or flying out in the next few years. And I also, obviously there's a lot of VR headsets here. You could spend your entire day in one if you wanted to, but a company called Whisk, with no H, and you can do a VR simulation of what it will be like, as they think, by the 2032 Brisbane Olympics, to fly between downtown Brisbane and Brisbane Airport in a 4-seater air taxi with no pilot. And it will take about 6 minutes to get you from point to point. It's when you sit in the VR thing, it does start to feel actually remarkably plausible, and I don't know if it will feel as unweird when you're actually up in the air in a thing with no pilot, but it's amazingly how quickly you sort of get accustomed to the idea. Though you do have the advantage of knowing that fundamentally you are sitting on a chair in a field in Hampshire.
And now I was thinking only, Andrew, if they could get you from here to Australia in 6 minutes flat as well.
That would be amazing. But I haven't. Nobody that I have found is offering the supersonic Australia trip, which is a shame because I would be into that. But given everything we've just discussed, I think there might be certain presentational difficulties because I think, annoyingly, we are way away from the first electric Concorde.
Andrew Muller, thank you for joining us while you wait for that electric Concorde. And that is all the time we have for this edition of the Monocle Daily. A big thanks to my panelists today, Alex von Tunzelmann and Charles Hecker. Today's show was produced by Henry Rees Sheridan and researched by Gunnar Grunlid and Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Lily Austin. I'm Chris Termack here in London. The Monocle Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.